We picture iron as something torn out of the ground. Deep pits in northern Sweden at Kiruna, the red gash of the Mesabi Range in Minnesota, or trains a mile-long shafts driven into hard rock. That is where iron comes from, and everyone knows it. The nails that held a Norse ship together on the coast of Newfoundland around the year 1000 did not come from any of that. They came out of a swamp. A crew skimmed soft brown lumps off the floor of a bog beside their houses, roasted them over a fire, melted them down in a clay furnace no bigger than a barrel, and hammered the result into rivets. No mine, no shaft, no rock at all. And more than 600 years later, on the far side of the same ocean, the cannon shot that armies fired in the American Revolution came out of exactly the same kind of ground. This is a story about the ore almost nobody has heard of, the one that came from the water instead of the rock, like bog iron. Let me be honest about the scope before going further, because this channel has been burned once already by a title that claimed more than the history could carry. Most of the iron in the world did not come from bogs. It never has. The steel in a car, the beams inside a wall, the rails under a train were all made from mined rock, from hematite and magnetite, hauled out of open pits and deep seams that dwarf anything a marsh could offer. Bog iron is low grade. It is full of impurities. No modern mill would look at it twice. So when the claim is that bog iron built the world, the real meaning is narrower and stranger than the phrase suggests. In the places that had no rich rock ore and no way to reach it, iron came out of wet ground instead for centuries. The Viking North ran on it. The first ironworks of colonial America ran on it. And it did all of that without a single mine, because the source kept refilling itself. Start with what the stuff actually is. Bog iron is not a vein running through stone. It is a sediment, a scatter of soft brown lumps that forms near the surface of bogs, marshes, and slow, waterlogged ground. Chemically, it is a jumble of hydrated iron oxides, mostly a mineral called guthite, lumped together under the old catch-all name limonite. The word that matters is surface. This ore does not lie 100 meters down inside rock. It gathers at the top of a swamp where a person standing in the shallows can rake it up by hand. That single fact, its nearness to the surface, is why bog iron was, in a great many places around the world, the very first iron ore people ever learned to use. It asked for no mining, no shafts, no knowledge of geology. It asked only that someone notice the brown lumps and be willing to get wet. How the iron gets there is a small piece of quiet chemistry. Rain and groundwater move through soil and pick up iron in a dissolved form, the kind that stays invisible in water so long as there is little oxygen around it. That iron-loaded water seeps downhill toward the low, wet places. When it finally reaches open bog and meets the air, the chemistry flips. The dissolved iron can no longer stay dissolved. It turns solid, falls out of the water as a rusty precipitate, and settles into the peat as ore. Some of that work is done by chemistry alone. Some of it is done by living things. There are bacteria that make their living off this exact reaction. Iron oxidizers with names like Gallionella and Leptothrix, and they leave their signature in the orange scum and rusty films you have seen on any stagnant ditch. This is a good place to slow down, because the details are a real open question. How much of the ore those bacteria actively build, and how much is plain chemistry that they merely live alongside, is still argued by the people who study it. Some researchers have made the same rusty films form in a jar with nothing alive in it at all. Faced with that disagreement, I find the cautious reading the honest one. The microbes are certainly present, they clearly speed the reaction along, and whether they are the true cause or simply the passengers has not been settled. Either way, the swamp makes iron, and it keeps making it. That is the fact that decided how this ore was used for the whole of its history. Dig the iron out of a bog, and the water keeps coming, the chemistry keeps running, and the deposit slowly rebuilds itself. Geologists estimate that a worked bog can regrow a useful crop of ore within about 20 years. Iron that grows back. The first time I read that, I assumed it was a folk exaggeration, the sort of thing a local guide tells visitors. It is not. It sits in the mineralogy. A generation after your grandfather stripped a patch of bog bare, you could stand in the same water and work it again. Turning that ore into metal was its own craft, and for most of history, it did not involve melting at all. You cannot simply pour bog ore out as liquid iron the way a modern furnace does. That takes heat the early world could not reach. First, the raw ore was roasted over an open fire to drive off its water and crack it apart, which is why excavated smelting sites are ringed with the scorched, reddened remains of that step. Then came the furnace. They used a bloomery, a squat chimney of clay and stone packed with charcoal and crushed ore and fed with air from bellows. Inside, the fire never melted the metal. It stripped the oxygen out of the ore, while the iron stayed solid and left behind a hot, spongy mass, shot through with glassy waste, a lump called a bloom. Then the real labor began. Hammer that bloom, fold it, hammer it again, and the waste squeezes out, while the iron knits together into a solid, workable bar. Wrought iron, tools, nails, blades. Which brings us back to that Norse crew in Newfoundland. At the northern tip of the island, at a place called Meadows, there is a low spread of grassy mounds beside a shallow bog. For most of the 20th century, no one knew what they were. Then, in 1960, a Norwegian named Helge Ingstad and his wife, the archaeologist Anstein Ingstad, followed clues buried in the old Icelandic sagas to this exact spot, and over the following years, she excavated it. What came out of the ground settled one of the longest-running arguments in the history of exploration. Turf-walled houses built in the Greenland and Iceland style, a bronze cloak pin, a soapstone whirl for spinning wool, boat rivets of iron, and a small separate hut with a furnace inside it, surrounded by slag and the roasted remains of bog ore. The Norse had built a smithy at the very edge of North America, around the year 1000, and they had fed it with iron skimmed from the bog next door. Birgitta Wallace, the archaeologist who studied the site for decades afterward, traced the slag back to that bog and reconstructed the whole modest operation from what was left behind, something like 15 kilograms of slag from what appears to be a single firing of the furnace, yielding perhaps 3 kilograms of usable iron. Not much, enough for 100 or 200 nails, enough to mend a ship. Sit with what that scene actually was. A small band of people, 1,000 miles of frozen sea from the nearest friendly coast, standing in a foreign marsh and pulling brown lumps out of the mud so they could repair the very boats they would need to escape. This was the first iron known to have been smelted anywhere in the Americas. It came from a swamp, and the people doing it thought so little of the technique that they barely troubled to do it well. The slag they left behind shows they gave up iron a more careful smith would have saved. That carelessness is the real tell. To the Norse, none of this was exotic. Back home, it was routine. A large share of the iron of early medieval Scandinavia came from bog ore, worked in small bloomeries scattered across the uplands and forests, and the crews who crossed the Atlantic simply carried the habit with them the way you would pack a familiar tool. The full extent is hard to pin down, and I do not want to overstate a number nobody can prove, but the pattern is clear enough. A whole seafaring people drew a great deal of their iron, the axes and the ship rivets and the blades, not from mines but from wet ground that no one owned and anyone could work. Nor was this only a Scandinavian trick. Across much of early medieval northern Europe, in Poland, the Low Countries, the lands around the Baltic, accessible rock ore was scarce, and bog ore was simply what iron meant. For a long stretch of that world's history, the ordinary answer to where iron came from was not a mountain, it was a marsh. Now, jump forward more than 600 years and watch the same brown lumps do the same job again in the opposite direction across the ocean. When English colonists reached New England in the early 1600s, they arrived in a land with no iron industry, No deep mines, and a hard dependence on ships from home for every nail, hinge, and pot. Iron was a strategic weakness, and everyone in charge knew it. Then they looked down at the ground. The marshes around Boston held the same soft brown ore the Norse had used, lying at the surface, waiting to be raked. John Winthrop the Younger, son of the colony's governor, located ore deposits near Boston and sailed to England to raise capital and recruit skilled iron workers. In 1646, under a manager named Richard Leader, they raised an ironworks on the Saugus River north of Boston at a site that became known as Hammersmith. This was no crude bloomery, it was a full integrated works, generally counted the first successful one in the colonies, and by now the technology had moved on. The heart of it was a blast furnace, a tall stone stack that this time did melt the ore, running it out as liquid cast iron before a forge reworked that brittle metal into tough, usable bars. Much of the labor came from Scottish prisoners of war, shipped across to work off their captivity. By 1648, the governor could report the works turning out roughly 8 tons of iron a week, and the ore feeding that furnace was dug, in the local phrase of the day, as bog mine, straight out of the surrounding marsh. The same ore the Vikings raked. A very different machine, 600 years on. Saugus itself did not last. Poor finances closed it within about 2 decades. But the men it had trained scattered across the region. The knowledge spread with them, and it took its deepest root in a landscape that is still half wild today, the Pine Barrens of southern New Jersey. The Pine Barrens are exactly the country bog iron loves: wet, sandy, acidic, iron-stained, threaded with slow, tea-colored rivers, and blanketed in pine that could be burned into a limitless supply of charcoal. From the middle of the 1700s onward, dozens of ironworks rose there, something on the order of 35 furnaces in all, with names like Batsto and Atzion. Charles Red built the furnace at Batsto in 1766. Crews raked ore straight from the riverbeds and bog bottoms. For flux, the material that helps carry off impurities in the furnace, they had no limestone at hand, so they burned oyster and clam shells hauled up from the coastal bays instead. Pine charcoal for fuel, river water for power, shell lime for flux, and iron out of the swamp. A whole industry running directly off the shape of the land. Then a war arrived, and the swamp went to work for it. During the Revolution, Batsto became an arsenal for the Continental Army, casting cannon, shot, and the plain iron gear that keeps an army standing in the field. The work was judged so necessary that its iron workers were exempted from military service. The new country needed them at the furnace more than in the ranks. A great deal of the cannon shot behind Washington's campaigns in the mid-Atlantic was cast from Pine Barrens bog iron. The British grasped this clearly. In October of 1778, they landed troops and burned the little port at Chestnut Neck, near the mouth of the river, in a deliberate move to choke off the bog iron supply feeding the rebellion. The furnaces were a target because they were a weapon. And the swamp was not finished when that war ended. A generation later, during the War of 1812, the Pine Barrens furnaces roared again and cast cannon for a second fight against Britain. The same ground, the same brown ore, arming the same country against the same enemy 30 years apart. Their guns reached further than that too. Cannon cast at the Hanover furnace in 1814 sailed with Commodore Stephen Decatur to Algiers. Swamp iron carried clear across the Atlantic to fight in the Mediterranean. Here's the honest catch, and it matters more than any single date. Bog iron was not good iron. Being loaded with impurities, it made a slaggy, uneven metal, and works that could afford to would blend it with better ore imported from Europe just to lift the quality to something dependable. Bog iron never won on being the best. It won on being there at the surface, free for the raking, in places that had no mines and could not afford to wait for one. It won on availability and on the single property no rock seam anywhere can offer. It grew back. Stand at a Pine Barrens furnace on a working day in the 1770s, and the whole strange economy is laid out in front of you. Men wade the shallows with rakes and long-handled tongs, lifting dripping brown clots of ore and heaping them on the bank. Others haul baskets of oyster shell up from the coast and barrows of pine charcoal in from the woods. The furnace stack, 30 feet of stone, roars day and night through its whole season, because once it is lit, it cannot easily be stopped. At the base, glowing iron runs out into channels raked in a bed of sand and cools there into bars and to pots, and the round shot that will travel north to the army. A swamp, a pine forest, and a tidal bay turned it to the hardware of a revolution. That is the true shape of the thing. The muckiest, lowest grade, most easily dismissed ore on the continent quietly armed the Viking North and the American Revolution both. And it did so without anyone sinking a mine, because iron never actually required a mine in the first place. It required wet ground and time. The bog was a slow machine. It took dissolved rock and moving water and, perhaps, the patient work of bacteria, and it laid down metal at its own unhurried pace. And when people carried the metal off, it simply started over. The mine, in the end, was the swamp, and the swamp refilled. We are used to thinking of a resource as something strictly finite, something you dig up once and burn once and never see again. Bog iron did not behave that way. On a human timescale, it was renewable, a crop of metal you could harvest and then come back for, closer to a fishery than to a mine. That is a genuinely different relationship with the ground, and it is worth sitting with for a moment, because it is so far from how we handle materials now. It ended, and it ended for a very ordinary reason. The bogs did not fail. Rich rock ore, dug in enormous bulk from places like the mountains of Pennsylvania and carried by rail to gigantic coal-fired furnaces, simply produced more iron, more cheaply, than any swamp could ever match. The Pine Barrens iron industry died out around 1869, plainly undersold. The one constraint that had made bog iron matter the absence of any better option finally lifted, and the swamp ore was quietly set aside and forgotten. But the reaction that made it never switched off. It is running at this moment. That orange, rusty sludge that clogs a farmer's field drain or stains the water in a new well or films the surface of a roadside ditch is the same iron coming out of the same water by the same chemistry the Norse skimmed off their bog 1,000 years ago. People spend real money fighting it today. They are fighting, without knowing it, the exact process that once armed a revolution. The bogs were never told they had been retired. Somewhere on that wind-swept tip of Newfoundland, in the fen beside those grassy mounds, groundwater is seeping up into the air over a bed of peat, and the iron is dropping out of it, grain by rusty grain, exactly as it did for the crew that patched Leif Erikson's ships. It has been doing that the entire time. In another 20 years, there will be a fresh crop of ore in that swamp. No one will come for it.